Out of the box, the Sony looked amazing. I mean, they're like, wow, this is the best looking TV out of the box. You're paying for a Sony Master Series Premium, and this premium actually is paying for what Sony invested into this color science, and one of that is a lot of people describe as a Judd offset. But if you get a calibrator in there, basically he's resetting everything to match this other standard. But I'm thinking, well, aren't you kind of paying more and then undoing that premium? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is Sony doing something magical? Is this Judd offset a real thing? Is it just calibrators and I just creating a conspiracy theory that isn't there?
No, it's a Judd offset is an absolute real thing.
And today's video is brought to you by Whokeys. Trying to build a PC on a budget but don't know where to buy your Windows 10 software on the cheap? Whokeys to the rescue. Use my code SF20 and immediate discount. At the bottom of this order where it says code card, to the right is the product key you need to activate Windows. So copy this long number, then go to the Windows menu and click on Settings. In the Settings menu at the bottom, select Update and Security. Select Activation, then select Change Product Key, paste what you copied from Whokeys, click Next, click Activate, and you're done. You can download a copy of Windows 11 Pro with my discount code SF20 and bam.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you buy an A95L and you get it calibrated, you're doing your TV a disservice. And Rob may agree or may disagree, but I really think that you paid a little bit extra for Sony to do its color magic. You get it calibrated, maybe some of that magic is gone. We'll see if Rob agrees with me, because talking to the other calibrators, maybe that is the case. So we'll see what happens. Now, what makes the A95L better in terms of what justifies the premium? Like I know for sure the audio just blew me away, but a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's okay. Talk about image quality.
Sure.
So what can you tell us about the A95L that if you were to tell someone you should get it because this, what would this be?
I think ultimately there are two differences. The primary difference in Sony TVs tend to be processing, right? Now, despite the fact that the A95K and the A95L share the same processor, which is in Sony's case the cognitive processor XR, there is a new feature which is exclusive to the newer model. So sometimes we'll release a new firmware update that is not just a piece of software, that also requires some hardware change as well, which is why it can't be rolled back, indefinitely throughout the entire history.
And this year in particular, you have a new MediaTek Pantonic chip.
Yeah, for the SoC specifically, so obviously when it comes to picture quality, that SoC isn't really doing any of that heavy lifting. Their TVs have lots of chips, right? Yeah. But the extra SoC does add some other special features. But from a picture quality perspective, we have improved the image sharpness and the noise suppression. And we call that XR clear image. So that's our Sony's kind of language for it. But essentially, it's better processing. And it's easy to think about it in the abstract. When you actually, and if you had a chance, you see them side by side, there's just more depth and texture and contrast at the micro level, right? Complex scenes like leaves and trees, there's just something else that's there. So there's that benefit. The other difference between going from Gen 1 QD OLED panel to Gen 2 is basically a doubling of the peak brightness potential of that television, right? So the overall dynamic range.
So here you go. Here we get to the tough discussion.
So this is obviously this is the thing that gets most people excited, right? That we're pretty simple creatures, right? We like diamonds and gold because they're bright and shiny. We like to think that we're sophisticated, but bright and shiny things we respond very positively to. And so that extra increase in peak brightness and therefore dynamic range is noticeable, and it is significant when you see the TV side by side.
I'm going to go into what I think could be a controversial position about the A95L, and maybe Sony in general, but we're going to limit it to the A95L just because I think Sony has put so much effort into both its design, engineering, development, and the color science behind it, because not only because it is represented at the shootout, but it represents Sony's image quality, right? Its best processor, its best XR clear. And my position is, after going through this entire calibration experience, right, speaking to the various calibrators, out of the box, the Sony looked amazing. I mean, they're like, wow, this is the best looking TV out of the box in terms of just without the reference monitor. They just really liked it. And then once you put it next to the reference monitor, go, okay, we see it's a little off, this and that. And so now we have to go into D65, which is So the D65 is a white point that is industry standard, that's chosen by Hollywood, and the reference monitor is D65. So obviously when the Sony is then matched next to it, it goes, oh, it's a little off. It's time to fix it. Throw out the meters, start doing all of that. But then I was thinking, wait a minute, you're paying for a Sony Master Series Premium, and this premium actually is paying for what Sony invested into this color science, and one of that is a lot of people describe as a Judd offset, right? The white point's a little bit different, but if you get a calibrator in there, basically he's resetting everything to match this other standard that Sony's like, well, we think this will make most content look great. So if you do that, hey, whatever you want, it's your preference. But I'm thinking, well, aren't you kind of paying more and then undoing that premium? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, because now you're here.
Yeah.
Is Sony doing something magical? Is this Judd offset a real thing? Is it just calibrators and I just creating a conspiracy theory that isn't there?
No, a Judd offset is an absolute real thing. And so essentially what we're talking about is if I give you the short version, and we can talk more about it, it's a difference between how a machine sees things and how a human sees things.
And when you say machine, we're talking about the meters.
Like a meter, how a meter measures light and measures color, and how we actually perceive light and color, and they're not really the same. When we calibrate a TV, or when we take a particular measurement, it's kind of an interim step. Since we can't actually have Tarantino sit down with us and put up a scene on the Hateful Eight and say, hey, Quentin, will you help us adjust until this scene is right? That's what we would want to have. So we have this interim step. Let's calibrate to this D65, and then hopefully that will also give us what Tarantino saw. And the reality is sometimes it doesn't do that. It gets us really close. The Judd offset is designed so that a consumer set will look the way the professional monitor looked,
so
even if the meters would disagree.
The term metamerism, you're adjusting for that visual difference, the metamerism. So, because a lot of people are asking, are you guys going to adjust for the metamerism? Well, Sony, out of the box, they made that adjustment. So we're talking about this. So my conclusion then is, where Sony starts off, they've already went through the entire process. They went through the meter, they did the visual adjustment, and then they arrive at the Judd offset. If we go through D65, then the calibrators will then do the visual adjustment. They actually end up close to Judd. At the end of the day, neither TVs are exactly D65, because once you start doing the visual, the perceptual calibration, you end up closer, but then if you take both and compare it to a meter, it would not be exactly to D65.
Right, and that again is the difference between how these scientific devices kind of work. So we rely on them to point us in a direction, to get us close. But if we just say that's it, then we're removing all the art and how we actually perceive, light and color. And so ultimately, that's why we ultimately made that decision. So one of the things that will happen here in the shootout tomorrow, or maybe later tonight, depending on how long it takes to all the TVs get set up, is each television, the professional monitor, the Sony TVs, and all the competitive models are all going to be calibrated, and then they're all going to be perceptually matched, so they all look the same in terms of color reproduction. If you were then to take a meter back to each of those, each would no longer be accurate anymore.
Right.
But they're right.
But they're right.
But they're right.
But there is a offset.
There is an offset.
There is an offset. And if Judd offset is accurate in Sony's mind, then why is there a Dolby Vision offset to D65 in Dolby Vision Dark? So now Dolby Vision has its offset. So in your mind, your offset is good. What about Dolby Vision? Why is there an offset there?
Yeah, so there are a couple of components there with Dolby Vision. So first, let's kind of clear the air when it comes to Dolby Vision Bright versus Dolby Vision Dark. From a purist perspective, there's one Dolby Vision, aka Dolby Vision Dark. Right. That's the actual look and feel. That's design. That's the creator's intent. That's the mode, right? Dolby Vision Bright is an offset with a higher average brightness for rooms with higher ambient light, because people don't watch TV in the dark. That's essentially what's happening there. So in terms of offset, there are some differences with how Dolby Vision content is generally agreed to look, how HDR10 content is agreed to look. They're very similar, but there are some differences with how SDR content. And so all of those conversations with the Dolby Vision engineers, even with Netflix and the color scientists at Netflix, we have those conversations. And we sit down with them and we tune the TV until essentially they're happy. That's why we have like a Netflix calibrated mode, and we have the Dolby Vision essentially calibrated modes and IMAX calibrated modes. When you're accessing that mode, what you're basically accessing is a mode where we have set down the TV engineers with those organizations and tune the TV until everyone goes, that's it. And we lock that in, right? So if that results in certain offsets, those are all byproducts. We never start to say TV must have an offset because, you know, arbitrarily it's got to have one. We sit down and get it to the point where people looking at the image say that's right, and that's what gets locked in.
That's interesting. So we actually have 3 different, well, we'll call them offsets for lack of a better word. So the HDR10, this is Sony in its own world saying, you know what, HDR10, that's the meta, this is what we think looks good. Then you have Dolby Vision where you bring on the Dolby Vision team, okay, you have your talk, that's an offset with Dolby Vision involved. So it's not just Sony alone saying, we think looks good, Dolby Vision, no, we think this looks good, and you're like, okay, it's your format, your offset, fine. I have to emphasize for the people watching, because what a shootout, you're here to find the king of TVs, but those who are buying the A95L, and I'm going to limit this to the A95L because we've had this discussion, and you've been generous enough to share Sony's design philosophy when it comes to the color science, which is, if you're buying the Sony A95L, the reason why all the TVs, including the A95L, has been calibrated to death, it's to make sure that the Sony looks like the reference monitor. That's it. The king of TVs as far as objective grading, which TV looks most like the reference monitor? Right. Because there is a reference monitor. But when you bring your TV home, there is no reference monitor. I believe that you bring your TV home, you open the A95L, I think it looks phenomenal out of the box. And if they were to get a calibrator in, now you're making the TV looking like a reference monitor that the differences may be so minimal. I don't know if it's worth that expense. Not so much, oh, it's too expensive, but rather, is it better? And so my question to you is, you guys did your whole thing with the meters and then the perceptual matching, and this is how you feel the consumer should see it. What is your position on calibrating the TV one more time, the A95L in particular, because this is your flagship, because you put a lot of effort into that, and that's why it's a premium TV.
Yep, it's a great question. I think there are a couple things to keep in mind. I think for the vast majority of consumers, the TV out of the box, calibrated with that Master Series extra levels of calibration, it's so close to spot on, you know, perfect, that you're good to go. Yeah. Can it be better? And I even mentioned this earlier. I don't really love using the word better because everyone's going to disagree on what better means. But could it be more accurate to a meter? Well, yes, there is some effect that your room can have, especially if you calibrate it for a bright room with your lights on and you have like fuchsia walls. Yeah. That's going to have a slight effect to the picture. Right. So having it calibrated can get you that extra...
So to adjust to your environment.
That environment. And you can get that extra feeling of accuracy, even if you may not be able to see the difference. Would it be more accurate? Yeah, it would. But when you already have a TV that's, you know, so far under, let's say, delta error 3, the perceptual kind of, but you can't see it.
Firmware update. Do they reset any calibration? Because, you know, they're spending money on the calibration that the owner may have done. Good stream, thanks.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking. It's a great question. No, calibration is not changed. So essentially, calibration is offset from base. That's essentially what ends up happening. So firmware updates don't adjust or change any of the configuration that you've made, right? Okay. What firmware updates will typically do is adjust kind of base kind of values, but any changes that you've made to base are persistent. So that being said, what I have seen before, sometimes with like an operating system update, like when some of the TVs will go from like, I can't think of the version we're on anymore. Is it P or F or S or what? But sometimes when it goes from one version to another, sometimes things like your DHCP for IP control, that will get reset. Sure. But nothing picture quality related gets affected in that way.
Okay, so this brings up kind of a related question, not necessarily Sony, other companies will not be named, but last year, QD OLED was released. Everyone loved it, it was super bright, but there's a huge complaint, the EOTF is way too high, that's why it's so bright. Mysteriously, after a firmware update, now it tracks it. The problem was I had to calibrate it when the EOTF was here, Now it undertracks because they literally shifted the EOTF down.
Right.
So Sony's policy is not to do those kind of firmware corrections, right?
Well, I can't say that something like that can never happen, right? Because it's hard to predict the future. But we certainly don't have that kind of intention. And if you do have a television calibrated, the firmware updates should have no effect on that calibration. Obviously, you spent money to do that, and the TV is now calibrated so that it reflects the meter, it reflects your conditions, and so any changes that we make shouldn't affect that overall kind of outcome.